Okay, this is your first video for Chapter 4. We're going to talk about sampling and surveys. So what is the difference between a good sample and a bad sample? And we'll talk about many different types of samples as well. These are your new standards that we're going to be reviewing in this chapter. So we're going to talk about methods of data collection and studies. Let's start by talking about sampling and surveys. An observational study. Observational study is one in which we observe individuals and measure variables of interest. This is a hands-off. We are just watching and recording. We do not manipulate the individuals that we are studying at all. And the difference between that and an experiment, we are collecting data on individuals in the experiment. However, we choose the group of individuals that will receive some sort of treatment and a group that will not receive that treatment, so that we can compare the response that the treatment groups poses versus the response that we get from the group that was not receiving that treatment. So an experiment, you as the experimenter decide who gets what treatment and who goes into the control group. The population is the entire group of individuals that is under study. So this is the group of individuals you would like to make a conclusion about. So this is everybody in the study that you would like to observe. However, because the population is difficult to reach, we reach a portion of the population by selecting them and examine them so that we can make a conclusion about the population. So the sample is the small portion of the population that we actually study, the ones that are either actually observed or experimented with or studied or surveyed, etc., etc. Ways that we collect the data. Sampling, what we do is we study a part in order to gain information about the whole. That's what we take a sample, and sometimes we take a sample multiple times. Multiple samples will give us better results, something that more along the lines of representative of the population. A census, however, does not take a small group of the population. A census actually attempts to contact every individual in the population. So in a census, this is a population study, whereas a sample is a sample study. So what we'd like to avoid in all of our studies, sampling techniques, etc., is bias. Bias systematically favors certain outcomes. So some portions of the population are either overrepresented or portions of the population are underrepresented. Underrepresented. So the data does not match what the population would actually look like. So there are two ways that we experience bias in our studies. When people choose whether or not they participate, and when interviewers choose whether or not people participate. And those things are personal choice. So therefore, it will always produce bias. If it is not random as to who is selected, and if it is not mandatory that those randomly selected individuals participate, then you will have bias. It has to be random. Bad sampling methods include voluntary response. So this is in which the people choose whether or not they should respond or want to respond, whether they feel like participating. And in that voluntary response, we have things that typically happen nowadays that are voluntary response that really produce bias. So opinion polls, call-in TV shows, internet surveys, you don't have to respond if you are randomly selected for those. So the responses will reflect only those who feel like responding at that time. You also have convenience sampling, and this is more of an interviewer's choice of bad sampling technique that produces bias. Basically, the interviewers choose the individuals that are easiest to reach, and it is not a random selection, and everyone in the population does not have a chance of being selected. Let's talk about some different sampling methods. You have a simple random sample, which is commonly referred to as an SRS. In a simple random sample, you take the entire population, and individuals from that population are chosen in such a way that everybody has an equal chance to be selected. So it's kind of like putting everybody's name into a hat and randomly selecting in names. One way that you can do so is by using assign everybody a number and use either a random digits table or a calculator to select however many individuals that you're going to be selecting. But you need to decide whether or not you're going to allow people to be selected more than once. That's the whole repeaters question. So you have to decide when you will use people to be able to be selected more than once and when you would not. And then using those numbers that you generated, you will select your individuals from your population. A probability sample is a sample chosen by chance. So a simple random sample, everybody has an equal chance of being selected. However, the people in that population are chosen by chance, probability. In a stratified random sample, we divide up our population into groups, and we call those groups strata. And within each of those groups, we use simple random sampling to select in individuals from each group, from each strata, and those will be your samples. So it basically guarantees that you are going to touch people within all different groups that you have subdivided your population into. And those subdivisions are usually based on some characteristic. So like Greenbrier High School can be subdivided based on class, so freshman, sophomore, junior, senior, and you can select in individuals from each of those classes. A cluster sample is very similar, however, it is different. You divide up your population into groups or clusters, but then the entire cluster can be selected randomly. So the CSRA baseball teams, we put all of the baseball teams in the hat and select in baseball teams and sample every single individual on those baseball teams. A voluntary response sample and a convenience sample. Well, a voluntary response sample, we've kind of already discussed that. Let's say a radio show asks for its listeners to call in and express an opinion. That's voluntary response. Only those who choose to participate will. And then a convenience sample is another one that we've just discussed. Convenience sample is when you as the interviewer or your survey or sample collector decide to use individuals which are easiest for you to reach. And that, of course, produces bias as well. What's the difference between stratified and cluster? And stratified, of course, we've divided up into groups, and cluster, we divided up into groups. However, with the stratified, we select in individuals from each group, whereas in cluster, we select in groups, in entire groups, and survey everybody inside each of those clusters. Okay? And then we also have multi-stage sampling design, when we can choose a sample within a sample within a sample. And it sounds like it is tricky, and it really just narrows the scope of your sampling into smaller groups, but it still allows everybody to have a shot at being chosen, which eliminates bias. And that does it for today, and we will see you in class tomorrow. Make sure that you bring your notes.